Hello everyone, back tuning into the second Spring 2019 Analogues update. So we've done one Spring Analogues update so far this season, and we've also done one season model roundup for the spring. We're very, very late with the spring updates this year due to the shutdown that occurred in America and caused large parts of NOAA to close down, including the reanalysis section of NOAA through December and a lot of January. So we've done one Analogues update. We've got our second one coming up tonight. Going to do two more. Got 2 more weeks that we can bring you Analogues, and then I've penciled in Sunday the 3rd of March as the day when we release a spring forecast. So whether we will actually be able to release a spring forecast on Sunday the 3rd of March is a bit of an open question at the moment, because we're so late with the updates. I haven't got a feel at all for this spring, I have to say, because we just haven't seen enough data yet. Maybe in the next couple of weeks we will be able to get a feel for this spring, be able to bring a forecast together for you. But to be honest, it's going to be a real struggle. It's going to be the hardest forecast we've ever had to release, if we do release one. And it may not be possible in the end to bring you a spring forecast. So I've got that date tentatively penciled in as Sunday the 3rd of March, when I'm hoping to bring you the spring forecast. But don't be surprised if we have to cancel it and say that we just can't get a forecast together. So obviously we'll keep you posted as we go through the next 2 or 3 weeks. But we have got some analogues for you for today. We're going to be looking at both January CET and precipitation, and I'll go on that for you very shortly. Just say that today's second video update will be the Gas Office Sunny Roundup. That's going to be turning up after lunch or around lunchtime. And I think we'll do our Ensembles Watch tonight. We usually do one of those in the winter on a Sunday evening. It's going to be quite a long video, so you can't watch it all in one go. Don't worry, it will be placed on the spring updates and forecast page with a written summary later on today, probably this evening, and that'll just go over everything that we talk about in the video. You'll be able to watch that video on demand at Gas Office whenever you would like to do that. Big thank you to our Analogues guru, James Ackrill. And without further ado, I think better get on with the spring 2019 update. So the first thing we're going to look at is the CET. So central temperature for January 2019 came out at 4.0. An anomaly almost bang on the 61 to 1990 average, just 0.1 of a degree above average, but basically more or less average. Excuse me. And of course, if we compare that to a more modern average like 81 to 2010, it would probably be a little bit, or it was a little bit cooler than average. But set against 61 to 1990, that comes out more or less bang on average. So this leaves us with a CET range that we're going to look at for our spring analogues for January CET of around 3.7 to 4.4. And that places, of course, January 2019 right slap bang in the middle of that range of years. So let's get on and have a look at our first analogue. So coming out first is January of 1856 with a CET of 3.7. The relevant spring is the spring of 1856. So this is how the spring of 1856 looks. It has an area of above average heights across Greenland, and then it has below average heights underneath it, running from the Atlantic into southern parts of Europe. The jet stream could be down here. So this looks like it would be quite a cold spring. This would be pulling cold air out of the north and out of the northeast with that particular spring. The next spring is 1862, following a January CET of 3.9. This one looks unsettled and a lot milder. This one has below average heights out to the west and through the UK. It's a bit of a blocking signal, but it's more over towards Canada. And so on the mild side of a jet stream, we're bringing the wind up from the southwest. That would be a relatively mild spring in 1862. The next spring is 1868, following January CET in 1868 of 3.9. Another mild spring. This one has above average heights down to our south. Below average heights are up to the north, and we will be bringing in quite a mild westerly flow off the Atlantic with that. So that's another pretty mild spring, probably relatively dry in the south. That's quite a strong ridge of high pressure from the Azores that's sitting just to our south in that spring. The next spring is 1904, following on from a January CT in 1904 of 4.4, and this one has a strong blocking signal. This looks like would be quite a cold spring. This one has a strong area of above average heights centered around Greenland and Iceland, with the below average heights pretty much of Scandinavia and central parts of Europe like that. We'll be bringing down pretty cold winds from the north and the northeast with that, so I reckon that would be quite a cold spring. In 1900, sorry, that says 1904 in my browser, but that should be 1900. There you go. So that is the spring of 1900. Sorry about that little accident. So the spring of 1900 is a cold spring, following on from the January of 1900 with a CT of 4.4. This one has the above average heights for Greenland into the middle of the Atlantic. And then the below average heights are through the central part of Europe. So cold spring in 1900. Right, our next spring is 1903. So this one follows on from a January CT of 4.2 in 1903. This one, a lot milder. It has below average heights over to the west of the country. Probably very unsettled, but we're bringing in the air from off the Atlantic. So that'll be a relatively mild spring in 1903. There's 1904, so that's how the mistake occurred there. This is the spring of 1904, following on from the January CT of 4.1 in 1904. Relatively mild month, or relatively mild spring. Again, we're bringing in those westerly winds from off the Atlantic. Quite unsettled, relatively mild. Next spring is 1911. This follows a January CT of 3.8 in the spring of 1911. We look like that, so we have above average heights to our north, below average heights to the south. You'll probably look around and think it's quite a cold spring, but actually it could actually be quite a mild spring, really. It's probably bringing in excuse me, again, quite a lot of easterly winds. And I suspect that will be a relatively mild and fairly dry spring in 1911, especially later on. If that sort of pattern occurs in March, it could be quite cold, but if that occurs in May, it's likely to be quite mild and relatively dry, but not really bringing low pressure in from off the Atlantic, unlike the spring of 1914. Again, this is following January CT of 3.7 in 1914. This one is unsettled, but below average heights are out to west. We're bringing in that westerly flow from off the Atlantic, so quite an unsettled, but again, relatively mild spring in 1914. They've got another one, 1915. So very regular springs here, early in the 20th century. It'd be interesting to see whether any other sort of decades are as frequently seen within this Analogues package as these years. We're up to the spring of 1915 now, following on from a January CT of 4.1. In January 1915. So this one, again, above average heights are out to our west. They extend up towards the south of Greenland. We've got below average heights to our east across Scandinavia, bringing down a bit of a northerly, northwesterly flow. That's probably quite a cool spring, actually. And I would have thought relatively dry. Again, the Atlantic is blocked off, although there's that trough of below average heights to our north-northeast. It wouldn't produce all that much in way of precipitation. So relatively dry, probably quite cool in the spring of 1915. Another one from this decade, we go through to the spring of 1918, which follows a January CT of 3.8. The spring of 1918 has a deep trough of below average heights to our west-southwest. It has above average heights to our northeast. Probably a very mild spring, this one. I would imagine we're bringing up winds from a southerly, southeasterly direction quite frequently. Fairly unsettled, particularly so to the south and west, but relatively mild in the spring of 1918. Into 1920s now, the spring of 1922 is looking like this, following on from a January CT of 3.7 in January 1922. This one looks unsettled. It has a deep area of below average heights sitting over and to the east of the country. The jet streams coming through the UK rather like that. It does have quite a strong blocking signal, but I'm not sure that blocking is doing anything particularly cold, just displacing that area of low pressure trough down into the Atlantic and over the UK. So it just looks like a very unsettled spring in 1922. Probably not overly cold. Spring of 1934 comes up next. So I have one from the 1920s, interestingly, after all those frequent years occurring in sort of the second decade of the 20th century, from 1910 to 1919. Anyway, we're up to 1934. It follows the January CET of 1934 of 4.1. This spring, 1934, is quite unsettled, but below average heights again are extending through the UK and through much of Western Europe. There's a bit of a trough within the 500 millibar flow as well, so probably quite a coolish spring, I would have thought, there in 1934, but relatively unsettled. Spring 1936 follows next, so again this is following a January CT of 3.7. And we have below average heights to our south. We have above average heights to our north and northwest. So Atlantic's blocked off. It's probably a relatively dry spring, probably favouring a lot of easterly winds in this spring in 1936. Again, if that happens in March, it's likely to be quite cold. If it happens in May, then it could be relatively mild. I think a pretty dry spring, and probably, excuse me, probably not an overly cold spring either. Voice is sounding very, very croaky this evening, so sorry about that. We'll persevere, and hopefully we'll get to the end of the video. I'm still suffering the effects of that annoying bug that I had before Christmas and over Christmas. I still can't quite shake off the cough and sort of dry throat that's associated with it. So sorry about that. I'll pause the video when we get to the end of the CT analogues, and I'm going to get myself a drink of water. Hopefully that will make things a little bit looser in my throat, but we'll carry on for now. The next spring is 1939, following on from January CT of 4.2. This one pretty blocked. It has a lot of high pressure sitting both over and to the north of the UK. Of course, we're just on the edge of going into that first really severely cold winter of 1939-1940. So maybe even at this point, even as early as the spring of 1939, maybe the pattern was starting to get itself together for that severely cold winter, severely cold run of winters, of course, that we had through the 1940s. This one with above average heights to the west and north of the UK, below average heights to our south. So a lot of dry weather, probably quite cool, probably bring wind in from a northeasterly type direction. I can imagine that would be quite a cool but fairly dry spring in 1939. No springs in the 1940s, interestingly. So we haven't got any springs from 1940s. Our next spring is the spring of 1950, following on from January CT of 4.2. in 1950. This one with above average heights sitting to the west or west of British Isles, below average heights over Scandinavia. So probably bringing in sort of a westerly, northwesterly flow. I imagine, again, relatively dry. There's no particular area of low pressure in the Atlantic, so it looks like the Atlantic is a little bit blocked off. Probably very normal temperatures, not particularly cold, probably not particularly warm either. Main thing about that spring would probably be, but it was a relatively dry spring. Then 1951 comes up next, so more in the 1950s compared to none in the 1940s. The spring of 1951 follows the January CT of 1951, which came out 3.9. This one with below average heights through the UK, so quite an unsettled spring. Above average heights in the North Atlantic, extended back towards Greenland. Probably quite cool and unsettled that spring. I wouldn't necessarily say it was that cold, but probably quite cool and probably quite unsettled as well. 1951. Then we go to 1960. This is how the spring of 1960 is shaping up. It follows a January CT of 3.8 in 1960. So we get this large ridge of high pressure sitting to our east over Scandinavia with low pressure in the middle of the Atlantic. And this will favour a lot of easterly and potentially southeasterly winds. That looks like a really nice spring, actually. Again, if it occurs in March, it could be a little bit cold, but by May, that will be producing some very pleasant weather indeed. I think the spring of 1960 did have some very nice weather indeed. Then we go to 1961, and again this looks like another pretty decent spring. This follows a January CT of 3.9 in 1961. This one has above average heights over and to the south of the country, below average heights in the middle of the Atlantic. Flow on the jets going like that. So we're on the mild side of a jet stream, and that will be a very, very nice spring indeed. Actually, potentially quite a warm spring in 1961. And then 1962. So we've got 3 in succession here, 60, 61, and 62. This is how the spring of 1962 looks. It follows a January CT of 4.3. Lot colder, this one. It has above average heights over Greenland and Iceland, below average heights through Scandinavia, back into central western Europe. Obviously, we're pulling down those cold north to northeasterly winds. Of course, this is the spring before the daddy of the winters, 62, 63. 1963 is the daddy of cold winters. This is the spring before that cold winter. And again, we're seeing evidence of blocking there. So maybe even as early as the spring of 1962, the pattern that will produce that severely cold winter of 1963, maybe even as early as the spring of 1962, that pattern was starting to get itself together. A cold and wintry spring in 1962, particularly cold in March, of course. The spring of 1968 turns up next with a January CT of 4.4. The spring of 1968 looks like this. It does have a bit of blocking signal again around Greenland and Iceland. Also has above average heights through some parts of Europe. It's a real messy picture actually. Below average heights are towards North Scandinavia and in the Atlantic. So weather's coming from all directions. I think probably relatively dry and reasonably mild in the spring of 1968. Spring 1970 is looking like this. It follows the January CT of 3.7. In the spring of 1970, we have below average heights to our east, above average heights to our west, and we're pulling down cold northerly winds. There's a really cold and wintry spell during March of 1970 in particular. Early March 1970 was very, very snowy indeed. Spring 1972 arrives next, following January CT of 3.9. This one, the spring of 1972, with below average heights both to the west, to the south of the UK, above average heights to the north. Probably westerly winds favour and reasonably mild in the spring of 1972. A long gap to 1984. This follows January CT of 3.8 in 1984. This spring with above average heights, kind of like centred over the top of the country really. Above average heights centred over the top of the country. Below average heights to our south. Favouring easterly winds. A lot of dry weather and quite mild in the spring of 1984. Another pretty big gap to 1992. This is how the spring of 1992 is looking. Very zonal sort of signal. Below average heights around Greenland and Iceland. Above average heights from the Azores extending into the UK. That was a pretty dry and warm spring in 1992. Particularly warm in May 1992. The spring of 1996 turns up next, so this follows January CT of 4.3. The spring of 1996 is a cold spring, following on from the pattern that we had through the winter of 95, 96, of course. This one has high pressure to our north, low pressure is to our south, but the high pressure is centred around Greenland and Iceland. Very easterly spring, a lot of easterly winds being brought in. It has a cold March with quite a bit of snow. April is closer to average, really. There's one decent cold snap in April, but otherwise relatively quiet month. And then a really cold May with some late season snowfalls. The spring of 2011 is next, following January CT of 3.7 in 2011. This one is a very warm spring, particularly warm in April. Very, very warm in April, and also very dry with high pressure just centred over the top of the country. We're bringing up those winds from a southerly or southwesterly direction. And finally, we've got the spring of 2017 in our analogues package, following on from a January CT of 4.0, so exactly where we are with this January CT, of course. And the spring of 2017 is also very anticyclonic. It has high pressure centred over the UK, but that high pressure does extend both to the north and to the south. So obviously a very dry and pretty warm spring in 2017. putting it all together, or at least the Januaries that have a CET range from 3.8 to 4.2, again placing January 2019 right in the centre of that range. This is how all the Marches combined are looking. So it has above average heights to our north and also to the northeast. Below average heights are in the middle of the Atlantic. So it's kind of 50-50 really with that, whether it could be cold or probably quite mildish. So some of those Marches I'm sure are bringing in cold easterly winds, but quite a few of them are probably bringing in more sort of southerlies to southeasterlies. So it's not a clear-cut cold signal. For a clear-cut cold signal, you will want the blocking in March more centred around there. You want this area below average heights tending to be more centred to our south, favouring more of a northeasterly flow. So there is a blocking signal. There is a chance that the Marches could be cold, that March could be cold based on these analogues. But I think overall probably favours actually rather milder Marches. The Aprils look like that, rather westerly with the Aprils, so below average heights, let's change colour, below average heights are to our north and above average heights are to our south, and we're bringing in just a flat sort of westerly flow. So relatively mild signal for the Aprils, probably quite unsettled overall. But there is a ridge that's quite close to us, just down to southwest from the Azores High. So maybe not overly unsettled, really, and generally westerly, generally favouring mild conditions. And then all the Mays, with a January CET range of 3.8 to 4.2, look like this. They have above average heights to the north, below average heights to the south. They favour bringing in easterly winds. Of course, May is always the month that favours easterly winds. Anyway, it's the month that's most likely to have winds from the east. Probably relatively dry and quite mild or even warmer signals, I would have thought, for the Mays. And as far as the springs themselves are concerned, so not a cold signal really. They do have a weak sort of area of high pressure to the north, but it's mainly centred away to the east, below average heights to the west, to the south, so probably near normal with rainfall and probably relatively mild overall, I would have thought. With these springs. Bear in mind, there are some cold springs that are in the mix, so you wouldn't totally rule out the chance of a cold spring. But overall, I don't think this analogue package is particularly favouring colder springs. I think overall they probably favour relatively mildish springs, and probably not overly unsettled springs either. Right, I think pause the video there. I'm going to go have a drink of water and just give a throat a bit of a rinse. And then we'll be back in around 2 seconds' time, and we'll go through the precipitation data. We're going to have a look at the top 21 driest Januaries on record and the springs that follow them. And the spring of 2019 is in there. So it was a very, very dry January of 2019 is in there. So it was a very dry January. You'll see where in that list of dry Januaries 2019 comes out at. And we'll go through the top 21 driest Januaries and the springs that follow them in around 2 seconds' time. See you in a mo. Alright, we're back and we're ready to resume our second spring 2019 analogues update. So we've just gone through the CET data. We're looking at January for this second analogues package. First of all, we looked at the January CET and looked to years within a range of 3.7 to 4.4 for January CETs, and we had a look at the springs that followed those Januaries. Now we're going to go on to precipitation. We're going to look at the top 21, or top 20, I suppose, if we exclude 2019, which we haven't got any spring data for yet, because that's the season we're forecasting for. So we're going to look at the top 20 or 21 sort of driest Januaries of the 20th century within the England and Wales precipitation list. So that's what we're going on to now. I've had a drink of water. I've got me drink of water ready. So let's get on. Hopefully I won't need to stop and have a cough and drink, but if I do, just bear with me, and we'll get to the end of this analogues package as quickly as we can. So we're going to start off with number 21 in terms of the driest January on the England and Wales record, at least back to 1900. This is the spring of, this is January 2005. So the spring that we're looking at is the spring of 2005. This one has a strong anticyclonic signal, so it has above average heights around Greenland, but also extending through the UK and to our south as well. It does have quite a strong blocking signal. Actually, it started off really cold this spring. The first half of March in 2005 was very cold. Then it got a lot milder. The rest of the spring was generally quite mild, and eventually it got quite unsettled as well by the time we got through to May. So after a cold start, 2005 was a relatively mild spring. Number 20 comes out as 1989. January 1989 is number 20 in terms of the driest Januaries on the England and Wales record going back to 1900. The spring of 1989 is an unsettled spring, actually, with below average heights out to the west. You will think it's a mild spring, but actually it is quite warm as it gets towards May. But in April, there was quite a cold April in 1989. Number 19 is January of 1929. This is the spring of 1929, and this one again, it has above average height centred around Iceland, probably favouring bringing in east or northeasterly winds. Fairly dry spring, but also probably quite a cold spring in 1929, following on from the cold winter of 1928-1929, of course. Number 18 in terms of the driest Januaries back to 1900 comes out as 1992. Just looked at that spring, of course, for the CET. It's also cropping up in our Precipitation Analogues package with above average heights to the south, below average heights to the north. It's a warm spring, and there's a lot of dry weather as well, particularly warm as we get through into May of 1992. We've got another one that just turned up in the CET package. So this is number 17 in terms of the driest Januaries back to 1900. This is the spring of 1914. Again, it's an unsettled spring, this one, and quite mild with low pressure out to the west, and we're bringing in those westerly winds from off the Atlantic Ocean. Right, this is the spring of 2019. Of course, we've got the question marks because we don't yet know what the spring of 2019 is going to yield. What we can say is that January 2019 comes out as at number 16 in terms of the driest January on the England and Wales record going back to 1900. So number 16 is 2019, and we wait to see what the spring of 2019 has in store for us. 1999 is number 15 in terms of the driest Januaries on the England and Wales record. The spring of 1999 has below average heights out to west, very weak area, above average heights to our east. Remember this spring quite well as a spring when the Phantom Menace was released in the United States, and what an uproar that caused. All seems a little bit silly now, but it was a big talking point in the spring of 1999. That film. It is a mild spring. It has the winds coming up from the south, so there's a lot of mild weather in the spring of 1999. Although it does have a cold snap in April 1999 in the middle of the month, but overall that's quite a warm spring. Then we have number 14 in terms of the driest Januaries on record, back to 1900. It's spring of 1973. Again, this one with above average heights out to the west of the country, below average heights to the east, and the wind coming in from the west to northwesterly direction. So we're blocking off the Atlantic, quite dry, but relatively mild in the spring of 1973. At number 13, in terms of the driest Januaries on record, back to 1900, it's 1902. The spring of 1902 looks cold and quite unsettled, has a pretty strong blocking seal up to the north, has below average heights to the east and southeast of the country. You'd think we're tending to be bringing in the wind from the north or northeast. That could be quite a cold spring, 1902. Number 12 is 1949. The spring of 1949 looks mild and dry with above average heights out to the west of the UK. Jet streams to our north. That looks like a very nice spring. A lot of dry and warm weather in the spring of 1949. Number 11 is a spring of 1935. This one looks colder. This one has high pressure centred over Iceland and going back towards Greenland with below average heights to the east and southeast of the country. Again, you will think we're probably pulling down quite cold winds with that one in the spring of 1935. Top 10. So the number 10 in terms of the driest January on record, on England Wales record anyway, back to 1900, is 1911. The spring of 1911, of course, turned up in the previous analogues package for the January CT. It's also turning up in terms of the precipitation side of things. Again, this one with above average heights to the north, below average heights to the south. Probably quite a dry spring, and I would have thought relatively mild in the spring of 1911. Number 9 is 1950, another one that occurred in the CET list. So this one, again, with above average heights out to the west, below average heights up to the north, probably quite dry. The Atlantic's blocked off with temperatures I wouldn't have thought too far from average. At number 8, it's the spring of 1905, looking much more unsettled, this one, with below average heights in the Atlantic breaking through to the UK, but jet streams coming into the west of Europe like that as well. Probably not overly cold, no strong blocking signal, but very unsettled in the spring of 1905. Number 7 is the spring of 1907. So this one looks really unsettled with below average heights to our west and also through the UK. Jet streams coming in off the Atlantic, so again it's another one of those unsettled but mild springs in 1907. And 1987 comes out at number 6, so the 6th driest January back to 1900 on the England-Wales record is January 1987, containing that severely cold spell of weather, of course, through the middle of January 1987. Probably the coldest single one-off spell since 1740 in that particular winter. The spring of 1987 looks relatively mild and dry. It has above average heights through the UK and going up to our north as well. Has a very warm April in 1987. So a freezing cold January, yes, but a very warm April. Number 5 is 2006. The spring of 2006 is looking like this. So below average heights are over to the east of the country, above average heights from the Azores building to our south, and a bit of a blocking signal as well. This is a strange spring. It's quite cold actually through March and April. Goes very unsettled and quite warm in May, and then we go off and running into a really hot summer. Number 4 is 1963, so the 4th driest January on the England and Wales record back to 1900 is January 1963, which of course is severely cold. It's in the daddy of the cold winters, 1963, but of course, as I always say, cold air holds less moisture than warm air, so because it's so very, very cold, it's also a very dry month, but then precipitation that does falls as snow, and it doesn't take much snow to produce disruption. And of course, there's no thawing going on in this month. It's severely cold throughout in January 1963. So it's just snow on snow on snow. And it doesn't take much snow when it's falling on top of snow continuously to cause real problems. Anyway, that's enough about January. Let's look at the spring of 1963, which is what we're here for. The spring of 1963 is a lot milder. We lose that extreme blocking pattern. There's still a legacy of it left over Scandinavia, but much reduced, much weakened. And we open the door to the Atlantic and bring in those westerly winds. So a rather unsettled and relatively mild spring actually follows that extreme cold and dry winter of 1963. Number 3 in terms of the driest Januaries on the England and Wales record back to 1900 is January 1953. The spring of 1953 is looking like this, with high pressure again centred around the UK, so it's a mild and dry signal in the spring of 1953, a mild and dry spring. Top two now. So the second driest January on the England and Wales record, back to 1900, is January 1964. So two exceptionally mild, two exceptionally dry Januaries, I should say. 63 and 64. That's quite interesting how that happened. Two very, very dry Januaries, but of course caused by very different patterns. There was no repeat of the severe cold January that we had in 1963, no repeat of that in 1964. The spring of 1964 looks like this, so it has below average heights out to our west, above average heights to our northeast, relatively mild and probably not overly unsettled spring 1964. And then finally, the driest January on the England and Wales record, going back to 1900, is January 1997. And the spring of 1997 looks like this. It's a very dry and anticyclonic spring with a large area of above average heights just centred over the top of the UK. We're on the mild side of the jet's up there. So, looking pretty decent, really. It has very mild January. It has very mild March and April. Also very dry March and April. It turns a lot more unsettled and cooler in May 1997. Sure you remember that May Day bank holiday weekend that started off really hot, and then by the end of the May Day bank holiday weekend in 1997, it was snowing, and that left us with quite an unsettled month, actually, in May 1997. But overall, the spring was very good, with a lot of dry and quite warm weather, particularly in March and April. Putting it all together, this is how Marches are looking when they follow these top 20 or 21 driest Januaries on record for England and Wales back to 1900. So pretty decent signal for March. Actually, it has above average heights to our north-northeast. It does favour probably bringing in some easterly winds, so they could be cold with those Marches. I think the main takeaway for March is probably quite dry signals in March. April looks a little bit different. All Aprils combined looks much more unsettled, even though we've got 1997 as number one. Overall, these look like more unsettled Aprils, a complete flip around in the pattern compared to March. These Aprils are bringing in low pressure and below average heights and wind and rain off the Atlantic on average. And then the Mays look like that. So the Mays that follow these top 20 or 21 driest Januaries on the England and Wales record show a weak area of above average heights just to the west of the UK, above average heights to the northeast. Probably quite a dry signal for the Mays, and potentially quite mild months as well, I would have thought. Putting it all together, this is how the springs themselves are looking when they follow those top 20 or 21 driest Januaries on record for England and Wales back to 1900. They tend to have above average heights weekly to the north, below average heights kind of to the southeast, but there is also above average heights kind of extending through the UK and to our southwest. Overall, quite a dryish signal, I think, for these springs, and probably relatively mild signals overall as well. So that's your second batch of spring analogues, and we'll put them together, of course, when we come to do the forecast. If we can get a forecast together for you, we'll put all of these analogues updates together, and we will attempt to bring you a spring forecast on the 3rd of March. I say whether that's going to be possible, whether we'll be able to do that for you, given how late we are with the spring updates this year, remains to be seen. But we're hopeful that we'll be able to get something together for you. Right, that's your second spring 2019 Analogues update. We'll be back later on today with regards to this Sunday roundup, and also, of course, have on Thomas Watch this evening. There'll be another spring Analogues update next week. This video will be placed on the spring updates and forecast page with a written summary later on today, just going over everything that we discussed in the video. But at nearly 40 minutes, that's all for now, and thanks for watching.